The past few months had been a whirlwind of deadlines, negotiations, and relentless travel. As a senior manager for an international trading firm, my calendar was a battlefield, with little room for anything outside work. The relentless pace wasn't new to me. I'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, juggling family, and battling jet lag. Yet, no matter how accustomed I was to the chaos, this stretch had tested my limits. It wasn't just the job that wore me down. A subtle shift had crept into my personal life, one I couldn't quite put my finger on. My wife Jean's calls had grown less frequent, her messages shorter. Even the kids sounded distant when I managed to connect with them during late-night time zones. It felt as though the fabric of my life was unraveling, thread by thread. But I kept telling myself that it was just the distance talking. After enduring a grueling 20-hour flight from Singapore to Chicago, including a tedious layover in Taipei, I arrived at O'Hare drained and disheveled. Though seated in business class, the experience was a far cry from luxury, and even celebrating my birthday mid-air felt hollow. Yet the real weight on my shoulders wasn't the journey. It was the meeting awaiting me back in Chicago, where the head of our international trading desk was poised to deliver a reckoning. We landed around 8:30 a.m., and I caught a shuttle to the Chicago Sheraton. I'd booked the room the night before, so it was ready when I arrived. After dropping my bags, I showered and went to the gym. I worked out for an hour, half weights, half treadmill, then took a long shower, finishing with cold water until I was practically frozen. After warming up, I was as alert as I could get. I headed to the hotel restaurant for the breakfast I'd missed: pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, sausage, and 4 cups of coffee. By 10:30 a.m., I was at J.P. Morgan on Dearborn for my meeting. They took me to a small conference room, and I was left alone for 17 minutes, standing by the window, silent. I counted to 1,020 Mississippi during the wait. From my time in Asia, I'd learned not to show weakness. When Joe Rutledge, VP of International Stocks, and corporate lawyer Samuel Young entered, I knew someone was getting fired, and it wasn't going to be either of them. Joe wasted no time. "What the hell happened in Singapore?" he demanded, slamming the table. "We sent you to stabilize things, and you approved buying $300 million in stock for a company with zero data." "Yes," I replied flatly. Joe's face turned purple. "Care to explain?" I calmly listed the facts. The CEO was top tier, the management had decades of experience, and the aquaculture project had real backing, including reports from Deloitte and KPMG. "Then why is their stock dropping?" Joe shot back. "They went public at $17, and now they're at $9.55. "You're missing the bigger picture," I told him. "We own 25% of the company. We're the largest shareholder, and the drop's due to short sellers, mostly Chinese, with some Thai and Vietnamese players, trying to tank the company or acquire it cheaply." Joe wasn't convinced. "It's just a failure." I stood my ground. "We need to stick to our plan." In the end, he didn't listen. "The council's made its decision. You're out." Samuel then offered me a severance package: 3 months' salary, vacation days, stock options, and nearly $800,000. But my reputation was shattered, and future job prospects were non-existent. By 2 o'clock, I had signed the paperwork, rolled my 401k into an IRA, returned all company property, and was escorted out. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling strange, as though something were terribly wrong. I quickly grabbed a cab back to the hotel, my mind racing with the thought that I might collapse on the street alone. In my room, I grabbed a mini bottle of whiskey, mixed it with 7-Up, and poured it over ice. Blasphemy, I know. I sat down to think. At 42, I wasn't ready to retire, but was I too old to start over? The only option seemed like a gamble. If I didn't have the courage to move forward, how could I expect others to? So I went shopping. An hour later, I had a new laptop with Windows 11 and the software I needed to track investments. I plugged in a flash drive with all my Singapore transactions, thoughtfully left behind in my hotel room to avoid trouble, and got to work. I checked our savings, $50,000. My investment accounts had $250,000 each, but they required 24-hour notice. I sold some blue-chip stocks and calculated that with my salary and stock options, I'd have over $1.2 million by the end of the week. I transferred most of it into an offshore account, Blue Sky International. By 9 o'clock, I ordered a hamburger and beer and pulled out my phone. It had been off for 36 hours. I debated turning it on, but was too mentally exhausted. Instead, I lay in bed watching the news, barely absorbing anything. Eventually, jet lag hit, and I passed out. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, I turned my phone on. It was flooded with messages. "Help, Dad. Mom is having a breakdown," from Dean and Katie. "What's going on with Jean?" from my dad. "Happy birthday, why aren't you answering your phone?" from Jean's parents. "Happy birthday, Dad," from Dean and Kathy. "Happy birthday, Adam," from Team Singapore. "Happy birthday, son," from my dad. "Happy birthday, little brother," from my sister Georgia. There were calls from Dean saying Mom had been crying but had calmed down. No calls from Jean, no birthday greetings, and no explanation for her strange behavior. It felt like I didn't exist. I caught the 8:30 flight to Springfield and called home to find the house in chaos. The kids had left their games and trash everywhere. The kitchen was a mess, and the laundry room was full of dirty clothes. It took hours to clean up. Later, I checked the aquaculture stock, down to $9.37. But I wasn't worried. When it hit $25, we'd be in a great position. I checked our bank account again. Everything seemed normal, but my mind was racing. I went to the garage, reconnected the Audi's battery, and it started right up. I went to the store, bought groceries for Thai green curry, and made a small victory out of the chaos. Jean's car pulled into the driveway as I finished cooking. The kids rushed inside, shouting that Dad was home. I hugged them tightly, kissed them repeatedly, and felt tears well up. Katie clung to me, sobbing. Dean was quieter, but just as glad to see me. We stayed like that for a long time, the world outside seeming to disappear. When I looked up, Jean was standing in the doorway watching us. Her expression was distant, almost sad, and a couple of tears rolled down her cheek. She waited until I stood, holding the kids, then pulled me into a brief, gentle kiss. "Welcome home, Adam," she said, her tone flat, her body language tense. Her eyes didn't linger on me for long. That smells good," she sniffed. "What is it?" "Thai green curry," I replied, beaming. Dean and Katie exchanged confused glances. "I don't know what it is, Dad, but it smells really good," Dean said. He smiled and hugged me while Kathy wrapped her arms around my neck, legs off the ground. "You two go clean up and get ready for dinner," Jean ordered. "You'll have plenty of time with your dad later." Jean gave me a quick hug and a kiss on the cheek. "You look exhausted, Adam," she observed, assessing me. "How come you're back so soon? I thought you were supposed to be away another 8 weeks. "Turns out the bosses didn't like some of my ideas," I admitted. "I just got fired." She flushed, struggling for words. "Well, we'll figure something out." "But what about you?" I asked, staring at the almost unfamiliar woman in front of me. After 15 years of marriage, she felt more like a stranger. "Are you?" Her eyes clouded. Then she quickly recovered. "It's work," she said, trying to smile. "The market's down. There's a lot of pressure on everyone." She gestured to show the gravity of the situation. At that moment, the kids returned from cleaning up and rushed over to me. "We'll talk later," Jean said, heading toward the kitchen. We sat down for dinner, the first family meal in 4 months. I served the food and poured Jean and me some cool white wine. Dean wanted Mountain Dew, and Kathy asked for water. We ate together, and I shared stories about Singapore, dragon boat races, ninja tag, and other team-building activities. After dinner, Dean and Kathy disappeared for a moment and returned with a wrapped present. "Happy birthday, Dad!" they exclaimed. Jean's hands flew to her mouth in surprise. I opened the gift, a Brothers in Arms CD set. I'd always wanted it, and I kissed the kids in thanks, their smiles wide with joy. Jean, looking embarrassed, said, "I'm so sorry, Adam, I totally forgot." I could have reminded her of the gold diamond earrings I'd given her for her birthday, but instead I focused on the kids. "You don't have to get me anything," I said, smiling. "Being home with my family is enough." Dean and Katie jumped into my arms, calling out, "Love you, Daddy." We chatted for a while, but soon they needed to do their homework, and Jean and I started cleaning up the kitchen. "What's going on with you, Jean?" I asked. "You're not the person I know." She stopped, then slumped, clearly weary. I don't know, Adam. I guess I'm depressed. You've always traveled a lot, but this last time was too long. It feels like we don't even live the same life anymore." She started crying. "I feel lost." I pulled her into a hug. She resisted for a moment, then let me hold her as she sobbed softly. We stayed like that for a while, but I knew we couldn't solve everything in one night. We agreed that we both needed to make sacrifices for a future where I could retire by 50 and we could enjoy life together. Afterward, Jean suggested I spend time with the kids. I helped Katie with her homework, then did the same for Dean. When I kissed Katie goodnight, I walked over to Dean's room. "Mom's not okay, Dad. he said quietly. She's crying and not doing much around the house. She even forgot your birthday. He looked around to make sure we weren't being overheard. I think she's having a nervous breakdown. Please fix it, Dad. I nodded, though I had no idea how to help. Later, I heard Jean talking on the phone. She hung up quickly when she saw me. Who was that? I asked, raising an eyebrow. One of the girls from the office, she replied, cutting off the conversation. We exchanged a long look. She wasn't going to talk, and I could sense her anger, though she wasn't showing it. Whatever was troubling her, it was serious, but I could already feel the jet lag hitting again, and I still had a lot to figure out. It was 9:30 when I checked the Singapore Stock Exchange. They had been trading for 2 hours, and CA was at $9.90, slightly up from the previous day. I went upstairs to wait for Jean. She finished in the bathroom, came out wearing an oversized t-shirt, and walked into the bedroom. I cleaned up and climbed into bed, reaching for her. She tensed for a moment before cuddling against me. Please just hold me, she whispered in a soft voice. I held her for a long time. Something was off. She wasn't the woman I knew. Had I been away too long? Was the separation too hard? But she never mentioned anything. No affairs, no change of heart. Then a thought hit me. What if she's sick? What if it's something serious, and she doesn't know how to tell me? I couldn't stop the worry, but eventually exhaustion and jet lag took over, and I fell into a deep sleep. In my dreams, I chased an elusive shadow I couldn't catch. I woke at 4:30, still feeling drained. I decided to go for a run, and promised myself I'd buy melatonin to help adjust my sleep schedule. After an hour, I returned to find Jean had left a note asking me to feed the kids breakfast and take them to school. It was still early, so I checked my bank account. The transfer from JP Morgan had cleared, so I moved the money into my offshore account. I checked CA stock, and it had dropped to $8.99. No longer rising, but heading down. I had to decide, fix my marriage or secure my financial future. Could I do both? I spent time with Dean and Kathy asking about their past few months. They mostly did corporate activities with Jean's boss, Anthony Miller, mini golf, movies, dinners out. Dean must have noticed my face. Dad, he said, she always said Mom was such a big part of the company, like we were all one big happy family. Katie nodded. Aunt Evelyn was always with us. I smiled, glad they stayed active, but now that I was back, I wanted to take a vacation together. They agreed, and I hugged them again before driving them to school. I made a few calls, including one to my old mentor, George Tallis. We talked about my career and the potential for investment opportunities. Later, I went to HHS Pharmacy across from St. John's Hospital. While leaving with some melatonin, I saw Jean and Evelyn Miller walking out of the hospital. They were holding on to each other, looking grief-stricken, and got into an Uber together. I watched them as they left, feeling confused. Was Jean sick or Evelyn? They didn't seem ill, but they looked deeply connected, more than just friends. A lover, perhaps? My mind raced. What was going on? I shook it off and went to my next meeting, staying focused on the business at hand. In the first meeting, Julian Knowles said he'd discuss the proposal with his group. The second, with Aaron Goldstein, went better. He liked the idea and transferred $10 million into my trading account. After the paperwork, I stopped for coffee at Starbucks when George called. He liked the plan and had interested investors. We agreed on a commission structure tied to the yield. I called my dad to discuss the COA opportunity. He said he'd invest $100K and wire the funds the next day. I then explained my situation to Jean, who went quiet, his methodical thinking kicking in. After a long pause, my dad said, "Her behavior looks like someone in mourning." "She's not mourning anyone," I replied. "Her parents are fine, living in Arizona." My dad paused, adding, "She has no siblings and her cousins are distant." We talked longer, and I had to agree with his assessment. He suggested I hire a private investigator, giving me the contact of someone they'd used in the past. At home, I called my contacts in Singapore and Southeast Asia to check the mood there. I recreated CA's risk profile, and it matched my initial report. Solid management, rational numbers, and the key factor, everyone in the management team had invested their own money. That made my position stronger. Everything was ready for trading when SSE opened. While waiting, I called the private investigator, Clarence Williams. His southern drawl felt deliberate, but his mind was sharp. He asked for a $5,000 advance, promising to start the next day, thanks to my dad's referrals. I sipped coffee, trying to calm my nerves. Dean and Kathy came home late from practice, and I spent time with them, but mentioned I had work to do. Jean arrived looking tired, but more focused than the night before. "I got Chinese," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "Are you working?" she asked. "Hi, Jean," I replied, keeping things distant. No affection came from her either, just like when I was a kid. "I'll be working from 7. "Okay," she said, uncertain. "I have a present for your birthday." She handed me a small gift, a card that said, "Happy birthday, Adam, love, Jean." Inside was a bottle of Hugo Boss aftershave. I thanked her, and she kissed me on the cheek, which felt impersonal. At dinner, Dean and Kathy talked about their day while Jean remained quiet. We discussed changes during my absence. Dean mentioned the old skate park being closed, and Kathy said it was good that Mr. Miller had turned a house into a shelter for misused teens. I raised an eyebrow. "You mentioned that?" I asked. "Tony wants a conservation project, and this is his way of doing it," she said, offering vague details. She seemed to be holding back. I didn't know Miller was into that kind of thing. "His wife started it before she died, and he's continued it," Jean added, almost smugly. "Why now?" I asked, pushing her for more. She paused, her expression hardening. "Now the opportunity is there." I nodded, pretending to agree. "Sounds like a great cause." She smiled back, and we got up to clean. I could tell she wasn't telling me everything. Her body language suggested she knew more, and it seemed connected to the personal issue I had helped clean up. After I took out the trash, I told her I was going back to work in my office. It was an hour before trading opened in Singapore. As I sat at my desk, I reflected on my marriage, trying to manage the growing pain inside me. I knew if I let it consume me, I wouldn't be able to focus on what needed to be done. But I also realized that holding it back could make things worse. Jean and I had always been compatible, agreeing on everything from where to live to how many kids to have. The past few years had been tough with my travel, but we'd always reconnected when I returned. This time, however, something felt different. I thought we were on the same page, but it turned out we weren't, and that made me angry. In Singapore and South Asia, many women sought out foreign men, some for status or money. I was approached daily in the office, on the subway, at markets, and in bars. Many of my coworkers dated locals, some even treated them like servants. I personally found it distasteful, but I kept turning down these advances because I was married to a woman I loved. But now I wondered if she still loved me, considering her behavior. I couldn't pinpoint any warning signs except for recent communication breakdowns. But for now, I had to focus on my work. When Singapore's market opened, California was trading at $8.49. I took a cautious approach, buying $5 million worth of shares. The market was flooded with sellers, likely driven by my old company dumping stock. The price kept falling, but I kept buying. Investors were panicking, hoping to salvage anything they could, driving the price down to $5.61. At that point, I made a final $15 million purchase, bringing our holdings to just over 10% of the company. I called George, and we shared a drink over the phone. By the time I logged off, the price had climbed to $8.72 as investors jumped in to take advantage of the lower prices. The short sellers were left stuck. After cleaning up, I climbed into bed, exhausted, and passed out from the melatonin pills I'd forgotten in the car. The next morning, I woke up late to find everyone downstairs. Jean was on the phone, and when she saw me, she quickly ended the call. "You must have been up late," she said, handing me a cup of coffee. I nodded, sipping. "We'll have to wait and see," I replied, trying to downplay the situation. She kissed my cheek and left to take the kids to school. I checked the stock price later that morning. It had rallied to $10.14, a good sign for those holding shares and a nightmare for the short sellers. It was time to stabilize the stock and focus on its potential, away from the games being played. After washing my face, I started catching up with our investment group. I visited the Miller Real Estate website. It was business as usual, with a mission to help troubled teens through their New Horizons House program. There were no further details, so I turned to Facebook. Anthony Miller's profile was filled with photos of his cars, vacations, and corporate events. One photo stood out, the MRE team, with Anthony in the center, Evelyn to his left, and Jean to his right. Two things stood out. First, Anthony Miller looked much older and had lost a lot of weight. He appeared haggard. Second, Jean was holding his hand and looking at him instead of the photographer. It wasn't necessarily significant, but it felt off. I browsed Jean's Facebook page, which was full of family photos, including a few from happier times. Everything else was mundane. Work, school, sports. There was no real insight, just surface-level updates. The last photo of us together was over 2 years ago, and most recent posts were cryptic, reflecting on life and praying for positive outcomes. I called Clarence Williams again, who reassured me that investigations take time. Then I spoke with my father, who advised me to avoid jumping to conclusions and let the experts handle things. I was torn between trying to fix things with John or doing nothing and risking regret. I called a prominent local lawyer for advice. She suggested I try to repair the marriage rather than rush into a divorce. There are rarely winners, she said. Mostly there are only losers. Next, I reached out to Chad, one of Jean's former colleagues. We met for lunch and I asked him about MRE. He was reluctant at first, but soon told me that after Tony Miller's wife passed away, he became less driven, and his daughter Evelyn became his focus. Chad added that Tony and Jean had become close, even calling her his office wife. Before leaving, Chad mentioned a rumor. Anthony Miller had been diagnosed with cancer. I followed up with a call to St. John's Hospital, where I learned Tony was in the oncology ward. Later that evening, Jean confronted me about visiting the MRE website. I tried to remain calm. I was just trying to understand what's going on, I said. She pressed me, accusing me of spying. I looked for what I found, I replied, keeping my poker face. She then mentioned I'd also checked Evelyn's Instagram. I was caught off guard. Why are you acting like this? She asked, growing emotional. I took a drag from my cigarette and exhaled slowly, knowing she hated it. Who are you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jean struggled to answer, finally saying, I'm your wife, Adam Carter. That's who I am. But her tone lacked conviction. She looked at me, unsure of herself. I'm not sure, she added quietly. I stepped back as Jean gasped and ran inside. I finished my drink and went to work. CEA's stock was climbing, hitting $11.92 with strong momentum. I stayed online, tracking the market. While most stocks were flat, CEA was showing significant movement. A couple of hours later, George and I agreed this was a solid trend we could take advantage of. That night, I crashed on the fold-out couch with a blanket. The next morning, I was surprised to see CEA closed at $13. The trend was strong, and our investors had doubled their money. If it hit $25, we'd see over 300% profit. After getting the kids off to school, I went to the gym, then grabbed a late breakfast at IHOP, making some calls. Later, I met with George for 2 hours to discuss starting a joint brokerage, with offices in Springfield and Chicago. He'd handle the business structure while I worked on a market plan. By late afternoon, Jean came home alone and we sat down in the living room. She poured me a bourbon and herself some wine. I don't know what you think I've been doing while you've been away, she started, tense. I took a sip. I haven't thought about it. Well, you've been very disrespectful to me, she said. I raised an eyebrow. Is that how you feel? She nodded but paused. I'm sorry, Adam, she said. You're not home anymore. We're like strangers. After 17 years, we're strangers because I've been gone 4 months? I asked, incredulous. The texts, Skypes, and calls didn't matter? She wiped away a tear. There was pressure, but you're my husband, and I'm your wife. She stood up abruptly, leaving me sitting there, confused. I heard her cell phone ring, but couldn't make out the conversation. It wasn't long before she came downstairs in a gray dress and pearls. Go shower and get dressed. I'll make a reservation at the Chesapeake, she said. In 15 minutes, I was ready. We drove to the restaurant, and she started with a gin and tonic. I ordered a Singapore sling to beat her to it. At dinner, she ordered mussels, and I had oysters. We drank Chardonnay and talked about the kids. She seemed unconcerned about my job situation. You're one of the smartest people I know, Adam. I'm sure you'll find something soon, she said, smiling. Her optimism didn't match reality. I was a pariah at the company, and our future now hinged on my stubbornness regarding CA. As the evening went on, we talked about friends and family, the usual stuff. She asked about former coworkers, and I avoided mentioning MREs until I had more information. For the main course, I ordered the captain's platter, and she had lobster. She treated me to wine, and I wondered if she was trying to get me drunk. If she was, it worked. The evening passed easily, and she was affectionate, caressing my hand and looking into my eyes. If she was having an affair, she was doing a great job of hiding it. When we got home, I went to bed, and the next morning I woke up to the smell of breakfast. Jean had made scrambled eggs, bacon, and English muffins. We ate together, and she told me about things around the house that needed attention before heading out to pick up the kids. I went outside to start cleaning up the backyard when my phone rang. It was Clarence Williams. "Can you talk?" he asked, and my stomach sank. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop. I quickly got ready, left work unfinished, and headed out. He was already waiting when I arrived. He wasn't what I expected. Small, unassuming, and dressed like a nobody, he looked like a man who blended into the background. About 5'7" or 5'8", gray-haired, thin, and balding, his clothes were basic and worn, like he shopped at Walmart. Yet the high-end cell phone he pulled out didn't match his shabby appearance, and I couldn't help but smile inwardly. He'd clearly perfected the image of a lowlife. We shook hands, and his firm grip confirmed that there was more to him than met the eye. Without wasting time, he got straight to the point. "Let's not beat around the bush, Mr. Carter," he said. "We didn't catch your wife at the hotel, but we have evidence that she's been having an affair with her boss, Anthony Miller, for at least 2 years. It's well known at the office." Clarence went on to explain that their daughter, Evelyn, knew about it and even helped cover it up. Jean had been leaving the kids with friends and spending weekends with Miller while I was away. The words hit me hard. My pulse raced as Clarence spoke, but I could barely hear him anymore. It was one thing to suspect an affair, but hearing it confirmed by a stranger was unbearable. He continued, almost as an afterthought. "Miller has aggressive pancreatic cancer. He's got only a few months to live." The news shocked me, confirming some things I'd suspected but didn't fully understand. It all made sense now. John's behavior, her emotional distance. She was mourning the man she loved. I opened up to Clarence about my suspicions, not because he was a friend, but because I needed to talk to someone. Clarence's next words confirmed my suspicions about the affair. "Cheaters don't just cheat. They're invested in each other. It's not just about sex. They go on dates, share experiences, talk about their lives. They develop a real relationship," he continued, explaining how cheaters justify their actions by blaming their spouse's perceived faults. I understood it all, but it hurt even more to think that Jean wasn't just cheating on me. She was emotionally invested in Miller. As we talked, we agreed to pause the investigation while I processed everything. Clarence left, and I sat there, stunned by the reality of my situation. My marriage was over. The idea of staying together for the kids felt pointless. Divorce was a fact of life for most families, and I knew it would be mine too. I tried to quiet the storm of emotions inside me, but it was difficult. I thought back to my time in the Far East, where business and life were viewed in multi-generational terms. But I wasn't a mob boss, and I didn't have any powerful allies. I was just a man, alone. As I sipped my coffee, I wondered how I could take revenge on a dying man. For Jean, it was simple. Take away something she loved. I didn't have a solid plan yet, but an idea was starting to form. First, I needed to deal with Miller. He disrespected me, my marriage, and my kids by pursuing Jean while knowing she was married. That couldn't go unanswered. My anger flared again. My work evaluations had noted 2 key traits, risk aversion and stubbornness. Now, both were pushing me to retaliate, regardless of the cost. A plan was taking shape. I called Clarence and asked him to find as many women as possible who had gone through Miller's program, hoping to uncover something that could work to my advantage. It wasn't a fully formed plan, but it was a start, and I was starting to catch big fish. In 2014, I was transferred to our Kenya branch for 3 weeks. During a weekend off, I went deep-sea fishing in the Indian Ocean. There, I learned a valuable lesson. You don't just fish for marlin. First, you use trolling lures to catch a smaller fish, then use that as live bait to catch a marlin. I succeeded, but felt sorrow seeing the marlin fight for its life. That would be my only big-game fishing attempt. But the experience gave me a plan. Back home, I tried to shake off my thoughts, doing breathing exercises until I felt like I could carry on like before. Jean wasn't home yet, so I went back to my unfinished tasks. When she returned with the kids, we had a nice family dinner. Steaks, corn, and coleslaw. I acted the part of the loving father and husband, while inside I was cynical and calculating. I suspected that, with her lover dead, Jean was trying to cover her tracks, using me as her backup. The time with the kids and with Jean was as fake as her attempts to salvage our marriage. Cynical Adam told me to remember that. After the divorce, I found myself living a double life, pretending to be someone I wasn't while watching myself play the role. It felt like watching an actor in a movie. On the bright side, George and I launched our new trading firm in Singapore, and CEA stock was climbing, more than doubling our investment. I became paranoid, setting up strict security on my devices and deleting everything unnecessary. I would upload data to the cloud, reformat my phone, and then call investors, preparing to buy out parts of their businesses. The non-compete clause didn't worry me. My layoff had made it irrelevant. My marriage front stayed quiet as I waited for new intel from Clarence. On Thursday, he handed me a flash drive with details on 14 women Miller had helped through his program. One worked as a courtesan, and I decided to contact her. I bought a new phone and arranged to meet her at a motel. She was small, tattooed, and introduced herself as Layla. After some haggling, I paid her for information on the shelter she'd stayed at after being kicked out by her stepfather. She told me she'd been taken in by Mrs. Miller after being found on the streets and had stayed there for months before leaving. Her story wasn't unique, but it gave me the information I needed. I asked her about her time at the shelter and whether she'd been bullied. After some negotiation, she agreed to help me, wanting $5,000 for her trouble. As we talked, I explained that Miller had destroyed my marriage and I wanted to destroy his. She raised her price to $20,000, then $25,000, promising to use the power of the Me Too movement to get back at Miller. We agreed on a plan. She would gather information, and I promised to help her start a new life afterward. I gave her my contact info, asking her to save it under a fake name. Phase 1 was complete, and I had the leverage I needed. At home, I kept playing my dual role, acting normal on the outside while my mind ran in circles. Jean seemed oblivious, too focused on the Miller Legacy project to notice. I continued to gather information on how far along the project was without raising any suspicion. We cooked and ate together like old times. Over breakfast, Jean mentioned she'd be busy helping with the opening of New Horizons House on Monday at 10. I already knew the details from the company's website and social media. I pretended to be interested and subtly probed. She mentioned the mayor and local media, including CBS, would be there. Did they stop the chemo so Tony could attend? I heard her ask. I didn't catch the answer. Jean got emotional, saying, "It's going to be life-changing." But I thought, not if I had anything to do with it. The divorce papers were ready, just waiting for my go-ahead. Illinois had no-fault divorce laws, and I couldn't sue Miller for loss of affection. It would simply be a case of irreconcilable differences. The day started well for me. Our stock had hit its issue price and was rising. After some coffee, I tuned into WMA radio. At 9:30, Evelyn was interviewed about MRE's social responsibility programs. She talked about New Horizons House as an evolution of her mother's work, which her father continued. It sounded like a feel-good story, and the host encouraged donations. But then a call came in that changed everything. A woman, Layla, claimed Miller had misused her. Evelyn freaked out, denying it, but Layla wasn't done. "Your father ruined me," she cried, revealing she worked as a courtesan because of Miller's actions. The station went into chaos, with listeners divided. Some dismissed Layla as a liar, while others supported her. The situation escalated when more women called in, each with their own harrowing stories. One woman even sobbed, admitting Miller had maltreated her when she was young. The calls kept coming, the story gaining traction fast. By lunchtime, social media was in a frenzy. Women across the country shared their own stories of misuse under the Me Too movement, turning the incident into a viral firestorm. I called Vicky, a journalist friend, to see if she'd heard about the WMA interview. She had, and after I mentioned my wife's involvement with MRE and New Horizons, she said she'd look into it. If true, it could be the biggest misuse case Springfield had seen in generations. By the time the dust settled, the damage was done. Social media was flooded with angry reactions, and the story spread worldwide. I felt a headache coming on as the weight of it all hit me. When the kids were at school, I collapsed into the shower, overwhelmed with guilt and grief. I cried harder than I had since my mother's end of life. The line I had crossed couldn't be undone. I had unleashed chaos, and now I had to face the consequences. Nietzsche's words echoed in my mind. He who fights with monsters must take care lest he become a monster himself. I picked up Dean and Kathy, then drove home to make chicken stir-fry with noodles and a small salad. We waited for Jean, but she didn't show up. I tried calling, but her phone was off. We ate, and I saved a plate of food for her in the microwave and a small salad in the fridge. Dean, Katie, and I played a board game while Jean was still missing. By 10 p.m., the kids went to bed, and I was alone when Jean finally walked in. She looked drained, like she had been through a storm. Her eyes were heavy, and her hair was disheveled. "You heard?" she sighed. "Have you heard what they're saying about Tony?" She groaned, collapsing into a chair. I handed her a drink. She downed half of it in one gulp. "Yeah, sounds like your boss is a carnivore," I said flatly. "Where there's smoke, there's fire." "No, Adam," she quickly protested. "He's a good man. He would never do anything like that." I pressed on. "Time for phase 2, Jean." She looked up, surprised. You obviously didn't know him very well. You don't know me, I shot back. We've been married a long time. You know what I'm capable of, and I know you. You may know Miller as your boss, but who knows what he's really like? No, she whispered, shaking her head. He's a good man. I'd know. I raised an eyebrow. How do you know? He's your boss. He could be hiding a lot of things. She sighed. I haven't interacted with him much, but I always felt like he was hiding something. He's the kind of guy you wouldn't leave alone with your wife or daughters. And, I asked. She froze, her face drained of color. No, never, she snapped, but her response was more defensive than certain. Because you're a beautiful woman, Jean, I said, and if what they're saying is true, he's probably not the man you think he is. She burst into tears, staring into her drink, as if hoping for answers that weren't there. She finished it, then headed upstairs, exhausted. Good night, she said quietly to the kids. After her shower, I pretended to be asleep when she came down in her robe. I heard her on the phone with someone, likely Evelyn. I caught fragments of her conversation. She kept saying nightmare and asking, why isn't there more than one woman saying she was attacked? Then she mentioned, I don't think this will go away easily. She made a second call. Hi, Tony, I heard her say, her tone more soothing. I caught snippets. It'll all be resolved. It's a misunderstanding. She moved to the kitchen and I heard her whisper, I love you too. The microwave beeped and she spent some time alone, likely snacking. By the time she went to bed, I was already asleep. Saturday morning, I made breakfast and took Dean and Kathy to sports practice. When I got home, I spoke with Vicky, who told me another woman had come forward, bringing the total to 4. MRE was distancing itself from the New Horizons project, and local civic groups were issuing denials. By mid-morning, the Attorney General's office had announced a full investigation. By the time I got home, the story had almost disappeared from the news. The stock market was closed, so there was nothing to do. I spoke with George about business and with my father about my marriage. He agreed it was beyond repair. I feel for Dean and Kathy, he said, but they'll adapt like all kids do. I called Jean. Where are you? I asked, concerned. Evelyn and the lawyers are trying to fight these lawsuits. She hesitated, but eventually the lawyerly advice couldn't help. Over the weekend, MRE's attendance dropped by over 80%. By Monday, the phones were ringing off the hook with canceled orders. The opening of New Horizons was postponed until the negative press died down. That Monday, a woman came forward with an unusual revelation. Married to a wealthy businessman, she shared that she had spent 8 days at the house before contacting her parents. During her stay, Miller had misused her twice. She left her lawyers details for all the other sufferers to contact, encouraging them to file a class action lawsuit. By the end of the week, 5 things had happened. First, Miller was interviewed at the hospital by the district attorney, but his condition worsened afterward. Second, 3 of the 5 women came forward and testified, all claiming to have been attacked around 5 years ago. Third, the media frenzy grew so intense that MRE shut its doors. Jean, still hopeful, told me every night how Evelyn was trying to keep the business afloat while vendors and customers left. Fourth, the stock price for CA had risen past $24, and I was selling shares in blocks. Each snapped up quickly without affecting the price. We recouped our initial investment and still held 2/3 of the stock. Fifth, I was ready to celebrate. My dad had taken Dean and Kathy for the weekend, and I'd bought a chilled bottle of 2012 Veuve Clicquot. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw an MRE-branded BMW parked next to Jean's Lexus. I entered the house to find Jean crying, with Evelyn consoling her. Ladies, I greeted them, walking over to the crystal cabinet. I uncorked the champagne with a flourish and filled 3 glasses. They stared at me, stunned, as I raised a glass. Salute, I said, drinking half of mine with a burp. Then the shouting began. John, you're divorcing me? I asked, coldly. I thought we were a family. I spotted divorce papers on the coffee table. Evelyn, how could you? I continued, turning to her. Adam, don't you care about your wife? She asked, but I just handed Jean a drink. We're celebrating the end of an era, I said. I finished my glass and reached for the bottle. Hello, Evelyn, I smirked. First, I could, and I did. Confused, she blinked. Second, I stopped caring about her when she became your father's hoe. I knocked over my glass in a mock toast. Here's to your father's legacy, Evelyn. I hope he lives long enough to stand trial so the world knows what a piece of crap he really is. Evelyn turned white and collapsed. Turning to Jean, I said, "Get a lawyer. The kids will stay with my father until custody is settled." Jean stared at me, terrified. It was clear I had become the monster I feared. Evelyn dropped her glass, and both women looked at me as if I were mad. "You left me alone so often. I needed human contact," I mocked. Jean tried to justify herself, but couldn't meet my gaze. "I understand," I said humorlessly. "And how's that working for you now?" Then Evelyn snapped. "How many women did you sleep with while you were gone?" she yelled. "All men want angels, but you all act like the piece of crap who fathered me." "Just because your father ruined women in marriages doesn't mean the rest of us stoop to his level," I shot back. I leaned toward Evelyn. "Your father is an offender and a criminal. He'll probably die before going to prison. His legacy project will never happen, and MRE will file for bankruptcy. His money will be frozen by the courts. You'll have to move and change your name." She trembled, crying. "I think you helped lure these girls, just like Ghislaine Maxwell did with Epstein," I added. She was speechless, horrified. "I need to contact the media about you," I said calmly. "No, please," she begged. "It's all a lie. My father's a good man." I turned to Jean. "You have 2 hours to pack and leave," I said coldly. "If you're still here when I return, I'll call the press." "Screw you," she spat. "I'll hire a lawyer first thing. We'll see who gets what." Jean whispered, "Oh, God," as her face crumpled. 2 hours, I repeated, and left. I drove a few blocks before the adrenaline caught up with me, and I started shaking uncontrollably for about 15 minutes. Once I calmed down, I called my father. I told him Jean had handed over the papers and asked him to keep Dean and Kathy with him. "Allow Jean to visit, but don't leave her alone with them," I warned. After the call, I drove aimlessly, stopping for gas before heading home. It was 10 p.m. when I arrived, and the house felt like a tomb, echoing with the ghosts of happier times. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't sleep. 2,500 years ago, Socrates said life without exploration isn't worth living. Lying in bed, trying to avoid examining my own thoughts, I couldn't escape the feeling that things were spiraling beyond control, and there was no turning back. I feared the chaos on social media might spill into the courtroom, and I worried I'd be implicated. I decided I needed to get Layla out of town to sever any connection to the issue. With that settled, I fell into a restless half-sleep. The next morning, I woke up just as tired. After my usual routine, I went downtown for breakfast and called the kids. Dean had sensed trouble at home, but I promised I'd talk to him and Katie soon. Over coffee, I reached Layla. "Did I do as promised?" I asked. "You did," she replied. We confirmed she was flying to Chicago the next day. I'd already transferred money to one of George's accounts, and then to Layla's. She was now $25,000 richer, heading to a new job in property management, thanks to one of George's contacts. While drinking my second cup, Vicky called. "3 women have sued Miller for damages. Papers will be served Monday," she said. We discussed the story's timing, noting how the publicity from Layla's claims had triggered others, much like the Weinstein case. I spent Saturday with Dean and Kathy, telling them about the divorce and their mom's affair with her boss, Anthony Miller. Kathy didn't understand, but Dean did. Afterward, we went to the golf course and had dinner at a Greek restaurant before heading to bed. That night, I returned to my empty house, filled with the silence of broken times. On Sunday, Jean's parents called, asking if reconciliation was possible for the children's sake. I explained that reconciling with Jean, given her affair with Miller, was impossible. "It'll all be settled in court," I assured them, ending the call and leaving them to process the reality of their daughter's actions. Life moved slowly and painfully. Dean and Kathy were back at my place, and my father helped out. Meanwhile, my business with George gained momentum. By the end of the second week, the media storm around Miller had quieted. Vicky told me a 4th woman had joined the lawsuit, but not Layla, which I found odd. I had a meeting with lawyers to divide property. I'd set up education accounts for Dean and Kathy, ensuring they were protected. Jean's lawyers were still digging into my past employer, suspecting a golden handshake. It was only a matter of time before they subpoenaed HR documents. I offered Jean nothing, as she had a job and was financially stable. She demanded $250,000 in cash and assets, but I countered that it was all lost in bad investments. I warned her lawyer that if she didn't take the deal, I'd drag the case out until they ran out of money. Jean insisted she deserved half, but I shot back. "Go ask Miller for money. You've had a better marriage with him than you ever did with me." The divorce dragged on for months. Jean vacillated between blaming me minimizing her affair and wanting to reconcile. One meeting, she threatened to move back into the house with her lawyer, but I warned her, "Try it, and I'll expose everything." As I left the lawyer's office one day, I saw Evelyn sitting in the foyer, glaring at me. I smiled at her, knowing the tables had turned. "You should have stayed out of this," I said. "What you sow is what you reap." 2 days later, Layla had another $5,000, and the local media was buzzing with the news that Evelyn Miller had helped her father, Anthony Miller, who was already disgraced. The district attorney faced growing criticism for not arresting Miller or taking action against his daughter. At a media briefing, the DA's office claimed they were still in the early stages of the investigation, but the press didn't hold back, fueling another storm. The public, still reeling from the Weinstein and Epstein cases, quickly turned its attention to Evelyn. Miller was sued by 4 women, and I began to worry. The case could derail everything I had planned. It was now 6 weeks since I returned from Singapore, and I was working from home when the doorbell rang. It was Evelyn. "What do you want?" I asked, annoyed. "Can we talk, Adam?" she pleaded. "No, I don't want to be associated with someone like you," I said, slamming the door in her face. She called again just as I expected. I opened the door and she begged, "Please, Adam, just talk." I almost laughed. "Where's your entitlement, Evelyn?" I muttered, then added aloud, "I don't think so. You just want to record me and twist my words." "I won't," she promised. "Good," I said, "but leave your phone in the car and wait here." I shut the door, set my phone down, and hit record. "Okay, talk," I said, sitting on the couch. She hesitated before sitting down on the edge, as though ready to run. She brushed her hair out of her face and started. "I know it's you, Adam. You're the one who created this nightmare." I stared at her blankly. She probably saw me as a snake in her garden. "Stop it, Adam," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't respond. She tried again, shifting tactics. "I know you were hurt by Jean's affair with my father," she started. "Whoever was hurt," I cut her off. "But this lie about my father abusing women needs to stop. It has to be disproven." I couldn't help but laugh at her. "There's nothing I can do, Evelyn. It's up to the court now." "Please, Adam," she begged, "make it stop. I know you can." I smiled coldly. "Now that everything's falling apart for you, you want me to help? Where were you when your father was entertaining my wife?" Her face turned red with shame. "Oh yes, you were helping, making sure she was your father's hoe," I said. We stared at each other in silence for a long moment. Then she asked quietly, "When will you stop, Adam? When will you be satisfied?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she fought to maintain composure. This was no act, I thought. She was broken. "Not until your family is completely destroyed, Evelyn," I said, my voice low. Her eyes widened in horror. She finally understood. "There will be no stopping," I added, making sure she got the message. "No ceasefire, no peace." She stood, silently processing my words, then asked, "How? How do you want revenge, Adam?" She was in her early 30s, unmarried, with no kids. Her Facebook showed a recent breakup. Stumbling, she reached the door, then hurried to her BMW and drove off, swerving down the street. I felt mixed emotions, satisfaction from the pain I caused her, but also disgust at my own cruelty. It was still early, but I needed a drink. The rest of the week was spent in law offices, handling clients and finalizing due diligence on 2 promising stock listings, one in Hong Kong and the other in Johannesburg. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit against Miller moved forward. The Millers scrambled to settle out of court, but the DA was unsure how to prosecute a dying man, so we all waited. I heard that the Millers had lost almost everything. MRE's real estate was sold off, and the women received over $2 million each. It was effectively the end of MRE. I still needed one last step to complete my revenge, so I went to the hospital to see Miller. I walked into his room without challenge. I was there to ensure he knew who had destroyed him, his legacy, his life. He lived for 2 more days before passing away. Evelyn had him cremated, and only 5 people attended the small ceremony. One of them was Jean. She wanted to take Dean and Kathy with her. I looked her in the eye. "I'll see you dead first." "You would, wouldn't you?" She spat back, her face a mix of fear and hatred, just like Evelyn's the last time we met. "I didn't realize you were so vindictive," she said. "You ruined him. It was you, wasn't it?" "And for what? Because he and I had a relationship?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. I laughed bitterly. "You're the one who planted the seeds, Jean. Why didn't you just tell me you wanted someone else? We could have divorced, and that would have been the end of it." She paused, then quietly admitted, I love Tony. He gave me what I needed. When he was with me 100%. With you, I always felt like your job came first. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. When we had Dean and Katie, I wasn't even second place. It was always your job, the kids, and I got whatever was left. I needed someone to put me first. I could have walked away, but instead, I pulled out my phone. Listen to this, I said, playing a recording of Miller's voice. Was it worth it? I asked. No, Miller wheezed. You ruined everything I spent my life building. I laughed harshly. It's your fault, Miller. I ruined you. How did you find out about me using them? He gasped. I laughed again, then stopped. I thought I was imagining it, but now I get why those women went after you. It only took one crack, and everything shattered. Screw you, Carter, he wheezed. He tried to sit up, showing the last of his defiance. Jean collapsed catatonic. I walked away. She was no longer my concern. When MRE started selling assets, I bought the house they were turning into New Horizons House for cheap. It wasn't easy to get everything together, but it fell into place like it was meant to be. Once the deal was done, I went public, announcing that I'd bought the house and was turning it into a shelter for misused women, run entirely by women. I renamed it Joy Carter House in honor of my mother. My dad cried and kissed me. Dean and Kathy were impressed. The house was put in trust, with me, Dad, and the 4 women who sued Miller as trustees, all contributing to make it happen. The local media hailed it as Project Phoenix, showering praise on us, though I stayed out of the spotlight. It helped me look good in court during my divorce. Jean got primary custody of the kids, and I paid alimony until they turned 18. She'd stay in the house, but pay half the mortgage. Alimony was off the table for her. During asset division, Jean accused me of hiding money. I told her to drop it or I'd ruin her life. She backed off, wary of upsetting me. That's what fear looked like. I told her she'd get a cut when the house sold, and we were done. The divorce took a while, but eventually I got a 3-bedroom condo for the kids. I had them almost every weekend. Jean went back to selling houses, so weekends worked out well for me. I missed the kids when I traveled, especially to the Far East, but overall, life was decent. I laughed at myself. Things were bad, but not that bad. Jean's relationship with Evelyn ended after I showed her the recording of Miller. I also circulated an edited tape of his confession. Evelyn left a couple months later, and I never heard from her again. I met Layla, whose real name was Leanne Roxton in Chicago. She had turned her life around. Did you know? I asked her, curious about the unspoken truth. She admitted that no one directly acknowledged the misuse out of fear. I offered $5,000 to a few women I knew to say they were misused, but Layla was skeptical. The second woman I reached out to was Rita French, who broke down on the phone. After the radio broadcast of Miller's daughter, Rita finally came forward. You could have made so much money, I said, sympathizing. She shook her head. By the time they sued Miller, I was in Chicago. I didn't know what was going on. When I looked again, it was over. But you gave me a good start, Adam. Thank you. That was it. My revenge was complete, and it had gone better than I expected. I kept telling myself I wasn't a monster, but was I? The Millers were finished, like something out of fiction. I'd learned the art of revenge and executed it in ways I never imagined. Business was thriving, and George was talking about retiring, maybe selling me his share. Dean and Kathy adjusted as teenagers do. School, friends, sports. Mom and Dad became background players, useful for cash and rides. Life went on. 4 years after the divorce, Jean married an older man. Dean and Kathy liked him. I remained single, still struggling with trust. Encouraged by my father, I started seeing a counselor to work through my issues. But it was clear I still had a long way to go. The lengthy journey from Singapore to Chicago's O'Hare Airport, including a layover in Taipei, didn't trouble me significantly, even though it took nearly a full day. The fact that I was traveling in business class on my birthday made it more bearable. I wasn't particularly concerned about the challenging discussion awaiting me with our company's international stock and share trading department chief in Chicago. However, my thoughts were preoccupied with the situation unfolding at home, which was causing me considerable worry. After landing at 8:30, I checked into the Chicago Sheraton Suites, showered, hit the gym, then took another shower, alternating between hot and cold water to wake myself up. I went down for a hearty American breakfast, which I had missed over the last 4 months, and drank 4 cups of coffee. Then I headed to my 10:30 meeting at J.P. Morgan, Upon arrival, I was escorted to a small conference room, and it was clear they were playing hardball. The room had 2 cameras, likely watching me. I stood by the window without moving for over 17 minutes, counting in my head. I had learned to show no fear or weakness, a lesson from my many trips to the Far East and Southeast Asia. Joe Rutledge, Vice President of International Stock and Commodities Traders, entered the room with Samuel Young, our corporate lawyer. The atmosphere shifted. This was a serious meeting. If it had been just Joe, we would have brainstormed solutions. If it had been only Samuel, the focus would have been on legal protection for the bank. But with both present, it was clear someone was about to be fired. Me. Joe gestured for me to sit and took a seat opposite me, indicating the tension that lay ahead. He demanded to know what had happened in Singapore. I acknowledged my role in approving a $300 million stock buy for a newly listed company, despite its lack of a proven track record. I defended my decision, citing the strong prospectus and the expertise of the management team, which collectively had nearly 200 years of experience. I highlighted the project's technological soundness and backing by reputable firms. However, Joe was irate about the company's declining stock price, which had fallen from $17 to $9.55 since listing. Despite the situation, I remained optimistic, explaining our strategy to buy more shares, anticipating a rebound that could yield substantial profits. I noted that we were the largest shareholder, holding 25% of the stock. Joe's frustration escalated as he argued that the company was tanking, fueled by short-selling competitors from China and Southeast Asia, aiming to undermine our position in the market. I reiterated the need to stay the course, but Joe dismissed my report as wishful thinking, informing me that the board had backed his recommendation. I was out. Samuel briefed me on the severance package, 3 months' salary, and nearly 30 days of accrued leave, totaling around $800,000. However, my reputation was in shambles, and my job prospects were bleak. By 2 p.m., I had signed the necessary forms, converted my 401k to an IRA, and returned my company materials, including my laptop. I stepped outside, feeling hollow, and rushed to catch a cab, battling thoughts of failing on the street. Back at the hotel, I poured a mini whiskey with 7-Up over ice, an indulgence, but I needed it. I pondered my situation. At 42, I felt too young to retire, yet uncertain about starting over. I realized I needed to take a chance. I bought a new laptop with Windows 11 and set up programs to track my trades. I accessed my savings account, which had $50,000, and my investment accounts had $250,000, but required a 24-hour notice for withdrawal. After selling some blue-chip shares, I estimated that with my severance, I would have over $1.2 million, which I planned to transfer to an offshore trading account, Blue Sky International. By the time I finished, it was after 9 p.m. I ordered a burger and beer from room service and hesitated to turn on my phone, which had been off for over 36 hours. I was too mentally drained to face any messages, so I lay on the bed, channel surfing for news on the markets, but found nothing of interest. Whiskey, beer, burger, jet lag hit, and I passed out. The next morning, still adjusting, I went for an early breakfast and checked my phone. It was flooded with messages. "Help, Dad, Mom's having a meltdown," from Dean and Katie. "What's going on with Jean?" from my father. "Happy birthday, why aren't you answering?" from Jean's parents. Birthday wishes from the kids, my dad, my sister Georgia, and the Singapore team. Dean also left voicemails about Jean crying but calming down. Jean herself didn't send any messages. No birthday wishes, no explanations. I flew to Springfield, Ubered home, and found chaos. Mess everywhere, unwashed dishes, a full trash bin, and a laundry pile-up. I cleaned the house and tackled the bedrooms, replacing sheets and organizing. It took 3 hours to get things under control. Finally, I checked my laptop. Southeast Asia Aquaculture, SEA, had dropped to $9.37. I was waiting for my funds to clear so I could invest. I called my dad. He said Jean had seemed sad and heartbroken for 2 weeks, but there was no clear reason. I checked our banking transactions. Nothing unusual. Same with the home phone messages. After folding laundry, I decided to cook. I reconnected the battery to my Audi, hit the store, and grabbed groceries for a Thai green curry with jasmine rice. I garnished the dish with spring onions, fresh herbs, and set the table, pouring myself a beer. Halfway through my drink, Jean's car pulled up. The kids ran in, excited to see me. I hugged them, kissed them, and told them how much I missed them. Katie sobbed in my arms, shaking, while Dean kept it together, trying to act more grown up. We stayed in that moment for a while until I noticed Jean watching us with a wistful expression, tears in her eyes. She moved in and kissed me gently, saying, "Welcome home, Adam." Her tone lacked enthusiasm, reflecting a sadness I couldn't ignore. The kids clung to me, and I shared that I was making Thai green curry. Dean expressed curiosity while Katie hugged me tightly. Jean instructed them to clean up and get ready for supper, then gave me a gentle hug, remarking that I looked wiped out and asking why I was back early. I revealed that I had been fired, and she reacted with shock, struggling to find the right words. We briefly discussed work, and she mentioned changes at her job, but I sensed there was more beneath the surface. Just then, the kids came running down, eager to be with me again. At the dinner table, I served the meal, pouring a cool California White for Jean and myself, while Dean opted for Mountain Dew, and Katie chose water. For the first time in 4 months, we sat down together as a family. I shared stories about my time in Singapore, recounting the fun team-building activities like dragon boat races and combat archery, which brought smiles to the kids' faces. After finishing dinner, Dean and Katie returned with a wrapped present, excitedly wishing me a happy birthday. Jean's expression changed to shock as she realized she had forgotten. I was tempted to remind her of the gold and diamond earrings I had given her, but I focused on the kids instead. Inside the box was a DVD collection of Band of Brothers, a show I loved. I kissed my children, sharing in the joy of the moment. Jean, embarrassed, promised to get me a present the next day, but I waved it off, saying being home with my family was enough. Dean and Katie hugged me, expressing their love. We spent over an hour chatting before the kids went to do their homework, and Jean and I started cleaning up. I noticed something was off with her and asked what was going on. She admitted feeling depressed, stating that my frequent absences had made her feel lost and disconnected from our life together. I pulled her into a hug, and she initially resisted, but then let me hold her as she cried softly against my chest. I wanted to comfort her more, but she seemed to need just the embrace. I reflected on the past 6 years of my management role, where I had become a troubleshooter for young teams. We had agreed to make sacrifices for a future of leisure and travel once I turned 50, but it felt like we were losing touch in the meantime. Jean gently disengaged from our embrace and suggested I spend time with the kids. I started with Katie, reviewing her homework before putting her to bed with a kiss. When I went to Dean, he expressed concern about Jean, noting she had been crying and forgetting things, including my birthday. Tears welled in his eyes as he asked me to fix it, leaving me nodding uncertainly, unsure of how to help. As I headed downstairs, I heard Jean talking softly on the phone. She hung up as I entered the room, claiming it was just a colleague from the office. We exchanged glances, but she remained guarded, revealing nothing about what troubled her. I sensed a deeper issue and felt the jet lag creeping back, but there was still much to do. By 9:30, I checked the Singapore Stock Exchange. CA was trading at $9.90, showing some recovery. Afterward, I waited for John to finish in the bathroom. She entered wearing an oversized t-shirt, and after brushing my teeth and rinsing, I climbed into bed. When I reached for her, she initially stiffened, but then curled into me, whispering for me to hold her. As I held her, I felt something was deeply wrong. Had my absence been too much for her? I worried she might have fallen out of love, or worse, that she was hiding an illness. My mind raced with unanswerable questions until exhaustion from the jet lag took over, leading me into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of chasing a nameless shadow. I woke up at 4:30 still feeling tired, so I went for a run and decided to get melatonin to adjust to Central Time. After running for an hour, I returned to find Jean gone, leaving a note asking me to give the kids breakfast and take them to school. I checked my bank account, saw the money from JP Morgan had cleared, and transferred it offshore. CA shares were down to $8.99, not free-falling, but steadily declining. I felt torn between fixing my marriage or my finances. I spent time with Dean and Katie, asking about what they'd been doing. They mentioned activities with Mom's boss, Anthony Miller, and his daughter, Evelyn. Dean quickly assured me Evelyn was always present. I smiled, telling them we'd go on vacation now that I was back. After dropping them at school, I called a few friends and then phoned George Tallis, my old mentor. We discussed my credentials and the CA prospectus, agreeing to meet later. On my way to my first meeting, I picked up melatonin from the pharmacy when I saw Jean and Evelyn Miller leaving St. John's Hospital, looking devastated, clinging to each other. They seemed deeply connected by sorrow, but not physically ill. I wondered if it was a shared lover or something more than just a friendship, leaving me questioning what was really going on. Whatever the situation was, they clearly shared a deep connection. I couldn't quite figure it out, but pushed those thoughts aside to focus on my meetings. I pitched the CA shares and didn't hold back, even mentioning my firing. Julian Knowles said he'd consult with his investment club, while Aaron Goldstein, a wealthy retailer, immediately liked the idea and agreed to invest $10 million once the paperwork was sorted. Later, George called, saying his group of investors was interested. We settled on a commission structure based on returns. I then spoke with my dad, who wanted to invest $100,000 and would transfer the funds the next day. We discussed Jean's strange behavior, and he noted that it seemed like she was mourning. That idea stuck with me as we ended the call. Before hanging up, my dad also recommended a private investigator he'd used before, suggesting I get answers. I spent the rest of the day on calls with contacts in Singapore and Southeast Asia, updating my risk profile on CA. The project was still solid, and the management team had their own money invested, which reassured me. It was a green light, and I was ready to start trading when the market opened. In the meantime, I reached out to the private investigator, Clarence Williams, who my dad recommended. He had a slow southern drawl, but I could tell he was sharp. After asking for a $5,000 advance, he said he'd begin investigating the next day, out of respect for all the business my dad had sent him in the past. With everything set, I paced around, drinking coffee, and trying to burn off my nervous energy. Dean and Katie came home late from sports practice, and I spent some time with them, explaining I had a major deal in the works. Jean arrived looking tired but more purposeful than the night before. She brought Chinese food and handed me a small birthday gift, Hugo Boss aftershave with a generic card that read, "Happy birthday, Adam. Lots of love, Jean." The gesture felt impersonal, like I was just a distant relative. We ate dinner as a family. Dean and Katie chatted about their day, while Jean remained mostly quiet. Dean complained about the local skateboard park closing, and Katie mentioned that Mr. Miller, Jean's boss, was converting a property into a shelter for offended teenagers. Surprised, I turned to Jean for more details. She admitted she had mentioned it, but offered little information, saying Tony wanted to create a legacy project. I pressed her on why this was happening now, sensing she was holding something back. She snapped slightly, saying it was a much-needed cause, but there was more to her reaction than she was letting on. After the kids left the table, I asked again why this was happening now. Jean's face went blank, and she gave a vague answer about the opportunity presenting itself. She was clearly hiding something, and while I kept a pleasant expression, it was obvious she wasn't being truthful. There was more to the story, and it felt personal. I helped clean up, took out the garbage, and told Jean I was heading to my study to work. With an hour before trading opened in Singapore, I sat down and reflected on my marriage, trying to stay rational, despite the deep pain threatening to overwhelm me. I wondered how we had ended up here. In the past, Jean and I were compatible in almost every way: where to live, how to spend money, vacations, kids. Even our bed life was good, despite my frequent travels. We usually planned for my return, turning it into a mini honeymoon, but not this time. Clearly, we were no longer on the same page, and it pissed me off. In Singapore, I was constantly hit on, at the office, on the subway, in markets, bars, and clubs. Many of my colleagues engaged with local women, often treating them as live-in maids with benefits, which I found exploitative. I turned down advances 10 times a week because I was married to a woman I loved. Now, Jean's recent behavior made me question if she still felt the same way. I tried to think of any warning signs, but apart from a recent communication breakdown, I couldn't pinpoint anything. There was a lot to process, but for now, I had to focus on my work. When the Singapore market opened, CA was trading at $8.49. I entered cautiously, knowing any large purchase would impact the market. With over $30 million to invest from my contacts in George's, I started with a $5 million buy. This triggered a flood of shares hitting the market, as investors tried to sell and cut losses. I suspected it was my old colleagues, instructed by head office. I continued buying in $5 million increments as the price kept dropping. Short sellers were pushing it down, hoping to buy back cheaper. The price bottomed at $5.61, and I made a final $15 million purchase. We now owned over 10% of the company, enough to get a board seat if we held on. I called George to celebrate, each of us enjoying a drink, me with Canadian whiskey, him with bourbon. By the end of the session, our buying sparked a rally, and the stock climbed to $8.72. Short sellers were in trouble. Exhausted, I went to bed at 2 a.m., forgetting my melatonin. I woke late the next morning, joining the family as they finished breakfast. Jean was on the phone, talking about something urgent. She asked if my trading went well, and I responded vaguely, not revealing that everything but our house was tied up in CA. Jean took the kids to school, and I checked the share price. It had closed at $10.14. The short sellers had lost big, and the stock was stabilizing. I spent the rest of the morning emailing our investors and catching up on business. Then I explored the Miller Real Estate website, which highlighted their New Horizons home program for troubled teens. They claimed to provide housing, meals, and support to help teens get off the streets and back on track. I didn't find much more on the Miller Real Estate website, so I checked Anthony Miller's Facebook. His page was full of vacation photos, cars, and social events. A recent company group photo caught my eye. Anthony was flanked by his daughter Evelyn and Jean. Anthony looked noticeably thinner and older, and Jean was holding his arm, gazing at him instead of the camera. I looked at Jean's Facebook, which had mostly old family pictures, with nothing new of us together in over 2 years. Evelyn's Facebook featured more photos with Jean, but nothing suspicious. Just cryptic posts about the meaning of life and hoping for positive outcomes. I spoke with Clarence Williams again, urging him to fast-track the investigation. He said he'd try, but warned these things take time. I also called my dad, who advised me not to jump to conclusions and to let the experts handle it. I was torn. Should I reach out to Jean to fix things? Or would that make things worse if I found out later I was being deceived? I contacted a lawyer who suggested it's better to fix the marriage than go through a divorce, as no one truly wins in such cases. Finally, I decided to play one last card. I reached out to one of Jean's former colleagues who owed me a favor. He had worked at MRE 6 months ago and agreed to meet me for lunch to share any insights. We met at Red Robin for burgers and a chat. Chad walked in looking like a classic realtor in a company golf shirt, chinos, and Dockers, sunglasses on his head. After some small talk over burgers, I got to the point. He chuckled, realizing I was fishing for information, and asked why. I kept it vague, explaining I had concerns about MRE. He got serious, mentioning that after Tony's wife, Dot, died of cancer, Tony lost his drive for a while. His daughter Evelyn took over, and eventually, Tony regained his focus. Chad then mentioned that Jean and Tony had grown quite close, and she was sometimes referred to as his office wife. He assured me he hadn't seen anything inappropriate, but acknowledged that office gossip can be cruel. Chad also reminded me that I had been away a lot, which could have contributed to their closeness. As he was leaving, Chad casually dropped a bomb. There were rumors that Anthony had been diagnosed with cancer. After he left, I called St. John's Hospital and found out Tony was in a private room in the oncology ward. I paid for lunch and headed home with a lot on my mind. That evening unfolded similarly to the previous ones. After cleaning up, I went outside with a whiskey and cheroot, enjoying the quiet neighborhood. Jean joined me with a glass of wine and confronted me about visiting the MRE website, revealing that they must have tracked visitor data. She questioned why I had been snooping, suggesting I had also checked social media pages. Her tone was accusatory, hinting she was ready for a fight. I kept my poker face, letting her words bounce off. She pressed further, mentioning that Evelyn knew I had accessed her Instagram. Jean was emotional, spilling some wine as she waved off my cheroot smoke. She began crying, but instead of comforting her as I usually would, I remained detached. Her tears seemed more performative than genuine. She insisted I was upsetting her, and when I questioned who she really was, she could only say she was my wife. I doubted her sincerity, leaving her speechless before walking away as she ran inside. I finished my drink and headed to my study. CA shares were rallying and had reached nearly $12, signaling a positive trend. George and I agreed this was not a fluke. As I monitored the market, I noticed some profit-taking, though CA was still far from its original listing price. A message from a JP Morgan contact revealed they had managed to offload some stock at a loss, but were holding out for better prices under orders from my old boss, Joe Rutledge. We both laughed at the irony, as it seemed Rutledge might be on the way out while I was proving my worth. That night, I slept on the pull-out bed in my study, avoiding Jean entirely. The next morning, I checked the closing prices on SGX and was pleased to see that CA had climbed to over $13, as predicted. Our investment crowd had doubled their money, and if we could hit the $25 target, we stood to make over 300% profit. I made breakfast, called the kids down, and ignored Jean throughout the morning. After dropping the kids off at school, I went to the gym, had a late breakfast at IHOP, and made some calls before returning home. I spent 2 hours on a virtual meeting with George. discussing the idea of combining our brokerages with offices in Springfield and Chicago. We agreed to move forward with the idea, and I focused on developing a go-to-market plan for the rest of the day. Late in the afternoon, John returned home alone. She told me the kids were spending the night at the Beckers and that we needed to talk. She poured me a bourbon and herself a glass of wine as we sat in the living room. I remained silent, waiting for her to speak first. Eventually, she became agitated and launched into her explanation, saying she didn't know what I thought she'd been doing while I was away, but that my behavior had been disrespectful and cold. She apologized, claiming she felt like we had become strangers due to my time away. She sniffled, saying she had been under a lot of pressure, but insisted that our marriage was all that mattered. After her emotional outburst, she excused herself, and I sat there sipping my drink, wondering if she was losing touch with reality. I heard her on the phone and later the bath running. When she finally came back downstairs, she was dressed in a gray knit dress and black pumps, wearing the pearls I had bought her years ago. She looked stunning for her age, even more attractive than women a decade younger. She urged me to shower and get dressed, saying she'd book a table at Chesapeake Seafood Restaurant. I got ready quickly, ignoring the urge to confront Jean as she seemed to be on the phone again. We Ubered to the restaurant, where she started with a gin and tonic, while I opted for a Singapore gin sling. At dinner, we stuck to casual conversation about the kids and friends, with Jean showing little concern about my job loss. She reassured me, confident that I'd find work soon, unaware that everything depended on my risky bet on CA. The evening continued smoothly as we discussed everyday matters, avoiding any talk about MRE. For mains, I had the captain's platter, and she ordered lobster. She kept the wine flowing, making me wonder if her goal was to get me drunk. Yet, she remained attentive and affectionate, caressing my hand and looking into my eyes. After dinner, she suggested we head to the gin mill to try artisanal gins. The bar was crowded, but we managed to order Negronis. Pressed close, she kissed me passionately, running her tongue across my lips. Soon we left, Jean dragging me out. In the taxi, she kissed me intensely, her hand inside my pants, keeping me hard but stopping short of making me finish. I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon, put on sweatpants, and went downstairs. Jean was making breakfast and greeted me with a kiss, teasing me about last night's intense act, joking that she should ration me more often. We laughed and shared breakfast while she mentioned chores around the house and yard. Afterward, she left to pick up Dean and Katie. I was in the backyard cleaning up when my phone rang. It was Clarence Williams. "Can you talk?" he asked, and in that moment, everything fell apart. I met Clarence Williams at a downtown coffee shop, expecting someone more like the detectives from TV shows. Instead, he was an unassuming small man, dressed in simple clothes and looking entirely ordinary. His appearance seemed designed to be forgettable, though his strong handshake and high-end phone hinted at more than met the eye. Clarence got straight to the point. He hadn't caught my wife Jean in any overtly incriminating situations. No hotel meetups, secret rendezvous, or physical acts of infidelity. However, he had gathered enough evidence through corroborated testimony to confirm that Jean had been having an affair with her boss, Anthony Miller, for at least 2 years. The affair was apparently common knowledge at the office, with Miller's daughter Evelyn not only aware but actively helping them meet in secret. Clarence detailed how Jean would often spend weekends at Miller's house when I was away, sending the kids to stay with friends. His bluntness hit me hard. It's one thing to suspect infidelity, but hearing it confirmed by someone else felt like a punch to the gut. My body tensed, my hands gripping the table as my mind raced with anger. Every instinct screamed to confront Jean, but I restrained myself, knowing society doesn't condone retaliation, no matter how betrayed I felt. Clarence continued speaking, though I barely heard him over the pounding in my ears. Eventually, he added another blow. Anthony Miller had been diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer and only had a few months left to live. The information hit like a final twist of the knife, leaving me struggling to process it all. Clarence's confirmation matched what Chad had hinted at, but now I knew the affair was not only serious, but terminal due to Anthony's illness. Jean's strange behavior suddenly made sense. She was grieving for the man she truly loved, trying to cope with his approaching death. I explained all of this to Clarence, not because I trusted him as a confidant, but simply because I needed to talk to someone. Clarence's response revealed his insight into these situations. He explained that cheating isn't just about act, but emotional investment. Cheaters often justify their actions by claiming it's more than physical. There are feelings involved. Over time, these relationships develop like any marriage, with shared conversations, private moments, and dreams. They find faults in their spouses to justify their behavior and indulge in the fantasy of a life without the burdens of marriage. This hurt more than imagining them meeting just for act. Jean had given this man her best self, free from the responsibilities and routines of marriage. He offered her only good times, without the everyday struggles that come with raising kids and running a household. It was a relationship built on escape and fantasy, while I was left with the reality of our marriage. After a brief conversation, we agreed to pause the investigation while I processed everything. One thing was clear: my marriage was over. Staying together for the kids was no longer an option. Though the thought of being separated from them was painful, I knew that many children lived in divorced households. My family would now be part of that statistic. I sipped my cooling coffee, feeling the intense pain take over every part of me. I knew I wanted to hurt John and Miller in return, but I had to calm my emotions. Thinking this way wouldn't help. My mind wandered to my time in the Far East, where CEOs approached life and business with long-term strategies, similar to Southern Europeans who wouldn't stop until they destroyed their enemies completely. But I wasn't in the mafia or some triad. I was just an ordinary man living an average life with no special power or influential ally to help me. I realized I was in this alone. I ordered more coffee, contemplating how to exact revenge on a dying man. Jean was easier. I'd take away everything she held dear, though the logistics of that were still forming in my mind. My immediate problem was Miller. He hadn't promised me anything, but he knew Jean was married and disrespected me by pursuing her. My anger flared again. I'd always been a risk-taker, and once I set my mind on something, I was immovable. That stubbornness now drove my desire for revenge, no matter the fallout, even if it crushed me in the process. A plan began to form. I called Clarence and asked him to dig into the troubled women the Millers had helped through their program. It wasn't fully formed yet, just another attempt to find something useful, like casting a wide net. I remembered a lesson from a fishing trip in Kenya. You don't fish for marlin directly. First, you catch smaller fish, then use them as live bait to lure in the bigger catch. On that trip, I successfully caught a marlin, though I felt a deep sadness watching the fish fight for its life. I vowed never to participate in big game fishing again. However, the lesson in catching the marlin inspired a plan. I drove home, practicing breathing exercises to maintain my composure and act as if I was still in the good mood from the previous night's lovemaking. When Jean arrived home later with Dean and Katie, we grilled steaks, corn, and shared a family meal. I played the role of a loving father and husband, masking the inner cynic. While I genuinely enjoyed my time with Dean and Katie, my interactions with Jean felt like a B-grade movie. She was buying into it, seemingly worried I'd put things together, treating me as her fallback plan as her lover was dying. The cynical part of me recognized this dynamic and stored it away for future encounters after the divorce. The following days felt surreal, as I lived out the lie while watching myself act the part I'd chosen. I wondered if actors experienced the same detachment when watching themselves on screen. On a brighter note, George and I finalized our new trading entity in Singapore, transferring the CA stock portfolio. The stock had surged to $16 and climbing, more than doubling our investment. My growing paranoia led me to increase security measures. I added fingerprint access, encrypted files, and wiped my phone, reloading only what I needed. I was becoming more cautious, ensuring nothing could be easily traced or compromised. After that, my focus shifted to exploring potential share listings and reaching out to JP Morgan contacts, laying the groundwork for future business. The non-compete clause wasn't much of a concern since being fired mostly nullified it. On the marriage front, things had quieted while I waited for more evidence, which arrived Thursday on a thumb drive from Clarence. Paranoia made me choose a new coffee shop for the exchange. The drive contained information on 14 women Miller had helped, 5 of whom still lived locally. One had become a full-time escort, indicating Miller's intervention hadn't worked for her. I bought a burner phone and contacted her. She agreed to meet at a motel for $100 an hour, and I had to pay for the room. Layla, a small tattooed woman, arrived on time and quickly offered her services. I stopped her, offering $1,000 for information instead. At first, she hesitated, thinking I was after something inappropriate, but I reassured her I only wanted details about her time at the home for abused women. After some hesitation, Layla eventually opened up. She shared her story. After finishing school, she left home because she couldn't stand her stepdad. Life on the streets quickly spiraled downward, leading her to sell herself just for food and shelter. Drugs soon followed, and she ended up working as a prostitute. One night, a client became violent, beating her when she refused to comply with his demands and dumping her on the street. Bystanders found her and called the police, who took her to the hospital. That's when Mrs. Miller got involved, offering her a place at the shelter after her discharge. Layla stayed at the shelter for about 6 months, but eventually left due to the restrictive rules. As she finished her story, we sat in silence. Her tale, though tragic, was all too common. I wrestled with guilt, wondering if my pursuit of revenge would make me just another offender. But my need for payback overpowered everything else. I asked her if the offense at the home started right away or came later. She hesitated, confused, before realizing what I was getting at. After some thought, she started negotiating, understanding my motives. She asked for $20,000, knowing I wanted to ruin Miller's life for ruining my marriage. Her boldness surprised me, but I saw potential in her plan. She promised to use the Me Too movement to her advantage and expose Miller. We discussed logistics. She wanted the money to start over and leave the life she was trapped in for the sake of her young daughter. I offered to help her secure a legitimate job in Chicago if things worked out, and her cautious hope turned to excitement. We exchanged contact information, and I gave her my burner number under the name Jerry. She offered a quick service given the time left, but I declined. With that, phase 1 was complete. At home, I maintained my internal conflict while outwardly playing the devoted husband, and Jean seemed to believe it. She was too absorbed in Miller's legacy project to notice anything unusual. I positioned myself strategically to gather information on the project's progress without raising her suspicions. We cooked and ate together like we used to, but I saw her differently now. I had closeness with her often, treating her like a means to an end. She might have thought we were making love, but to me, she was no different from Layla. Just more attractive. I took control, not caring about her pleasure. I made her give me BJ every other morning and never returned the favor. I felt justified, considering the cost of the upcoming divorce. And I was getting what I could while I still could. Oddly, instead of being upset, Jean seemed to embrace my new attitude. By Friday, she was giving me morning BJ without prompting. It was clear she was either enjoying the change, accustomed to more closeness from both Miller and me, or trying to solidify her position as my wife before her lover passed. Maybe it was a combination of all three. Over breakfast, John mentioned she'd be busy setting up for the New Horizons home unveiling on Monday. I already knew the details from their website and social media. The mayor was attending along with local media and CBS. She made a comment about Miller being well enough to attend, which stirred something in me. The divorce papers were ready, waiting for my signal to be served. With Illinois being a no-fault state, irreconcilable differences would be the official reason. As I started my day on SGX, I was pleased to see our shares climbing, a small but positive start to Friday. I tuned into WMA for Evelyn's 9:30 interview, where she discussed MRE's social responsibility program and her father's involvement in the New Horizons home project. She spoke warmly about how the program began with her mother and was continued by her father, now expanding into a fully funded community initiative. The host was enthusiastic and callers praised the program, pledging donations. Everything seemed positive until one caller disrupted the narrative. A hesitant voice on the line, breaking with sobs, urged listeners not to believe in the home's success, claiming it had allowed Mr. Miller to exploit the women there. She identified herself as Layla and accused Anthony Miller of ruining her life, leaving her on the streets as a prostitute. Evelyn, shocked and defensive, denied the allegations, insisting her father was a good man. The station quickly went to a break, and when they returned, the host struggled to regain control. Evelyn tried to defend her father, clearly believing in his innocence. Meanwhile, the phone lines lit up with mixed reactions. Some supported Layla, while others doubted her story, calling her a liar. The emotional intensity of the situation had turned what was meant to be a feel-good interview into a public controversy, with listeners passionately debating the truth. The chaos intensified when a woman named Rita called in, claiming Anthony Miller had assaulted her too. This sparked a flood of calls and social media posts, with more women coming forward, some sharing detailed abuse stories. The situation quickly escalated into a viral movement, making it hard to distinguish truth from exaggeration. I reached out to my old friend Vicky, worried about my wife's involvement with MRE. She agreed this could be a massive scandal if true. By lunchtime, radio stations fell silent, but social media erupted. Initially divided, public opinion soon turned against Miller, with countless women sharing their experiences. Feeling overwhelmed, I shut everything off, took Tylenol, and retreated to the shower. The weight of the day broke me down, and I cried harder than I had in years, realizing I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Nietzsche's warning about becoming the monster you fight described me perfectly. Miller had wronged me, but in seeking revenge, I had unleashed a storm beyond my control. All I could do was hang on and hope. I picked up Dean and Katie, then made chicken stir-fry for dinner. Jean was absent, her phone off. We waited, ate, and played a board game without her. By 10, she finally came home looking utterly devastated, her makeup smudged, hair disheveled, and the weight of the day's events heavy on her. She collapsed into a chair, shaken by the accusations against Miller. I handed her a drink and calmly pointed out that where there's smoke, there's usually fire. She refused to believe Miller could be guilty, insisting he was a good man. I began phase 2 of my plan. I reminded Jean that, as her husband, we knew everything about each other. But how could she really know Miller? He was just her boss. She clung to her belief in his goodness, but I pushed harder, suggesting there were things she couldn't possibly know about him. Doubt flickered in her expression as I continued to plant seeds of suspicion. Jean gasped in shock, turning pale as she asked if Miller had ever tried anything with me. I denied it, watching as she dissolved into tears, staring into her empty glass. Without finding any answers, she wearily headed upstairs, briefly greeting the kids before disappearing into the shower. Pretending to be half asleep, I listened as she made calls downstairs, first to Evelyn, repeatedly calling the situation a nightmare and questioning why multiple women would accuse Miller. Then she made a call to Tony, assuring him it was a misunderstanding before ending with, "I love you too." By the time she returned to bed, I was genuinely asleep. The next morning, I made breakfast and took Dean and Katie to their practice. Vicky called, informing me that 4 women had come forward, and the mayor's office, along with various civic groups, was distancing themselves from the project. The Attorney General had even announced an investigation. When I returned home, Jean was gone. With the SGX closed, I had little to do. I called George about business and spoke to my dad about my broken marriage. He sadly agreed it was beyond repair, feeling bad for Dean and Katie, but knowing they would join the many kids in the U.S. dealing with separated parents. I called Jean, who was with Evelyn and the company lawyers trying to fight the allegations. I warned her about the potential fallout, but she stayed involved. Despite their efforts, things worsened. That weekend, MRE's busiest days saw a massive drop in visitors, and by Monday, cancellations flooded in. The opening of the New Horizons home was postponed due to the bad press. On Monday, another woman came forward through a newspaper ad, accusing Miller of assault during her brief stay at the home for troubled teens. She encouraged others to join a class action lawsuit. By the week's end, 5 key things happened. Miller, after being questioned by the DA, worsened in health. 3 women gave detailed assault statements to the police, and the media storm forced MRE to shut down indefinitely. Jean confided in me nightly about how hard Evelyn was struggling to keep MRE afloat as salespeople left, taking clients with them. Meanwhile, CA surpassed the $24 mark, and I began selling shares in small blocks, making back our investment while still holding 2/3 of the stock. Financially, things were great. That weekend, my dad took Dean and Katie, and I returned home with a bottle of vintage Veuve Clicquot, ready to celebrate. When I arrived, I found a BMW SUV with MRE branding in the driveway. Inside, Jean was crying, and Evelyn was comforting her. I greeted them, uncorked the champagne, and poured 3 glasses. In their shock, they accepted the drinks. Jean then confronted me about the divorce papers she found, and Evelyn questioned my love for Jean. I coldly explained that I had stopped caring the moment Jean became involved with her father. I toasted to the downfall of MRE and threw my glass across the room. Evelyn, angry, seemed ready to attack, but I warned her not to try, leaving her terrified. Turning to Jean, I told her to get a lawyer and that the kids would stay with my father until custody was decided. Her shock at my behavior was evident, but I made it clear that all our recent intimacy was nothing more than me taking what I felt she owed me. I poured another drink while the 2 women sat speechless. Evelyn dropped her glass, spilling champagne on the rug. Jean broke hers, cutting her finger and sucking the blood. Both looked at me with fear, as if I were a madman. I sarcastically offered more champagne, knowing there would be no takers. Jean attempted to justify her actions, blaming my absence for her loneliness, but couldn't meet my eyes. I coldly replied, mocking her need for Miller. Evelyn tried to defend her father by accusing me of infidelity, but I shot back, pointing out that not all men were like her father, who preyed on vulnerable women and ruined marriages. I leaned into Evelyn, daring her to challenge me, but she knew better. I continued, condemning her father as a predator who would die a disgrace. His legacy project would fail, his money would be seized for future claims, and MRE would go bankrupt. I warned her that she would have to escape far away, carrying the shame of her father's actions and her own role in it. Evelyn was trembling and crying under my verbal attack, likely wishing she could hit me. I wished the same so I could unleash the anger I had held back for weeks. I compared her actions to Ghislaine Maxwell's role in grooming girls for Jeffrey Epstein, causing her to shake her head in fear and denial, insisting her father was a good man. I turned to Jean, giving her 2 hours to pack her things and leave. If she stayed, I threatened to call the press and expose her involvement. Furious, she cursed at me, but said she'd get a lawyer to fight for what she wanted. I repeated my warning. 2 hours. Leaving the house, the adrenaline finally hit, and I began hyperventilating, shaking uncontrollably for about 15 minutes. Once I regained control, I called my dad, instructing him to keep Dean and Katie and not let Jean be alone with them. Afterward, I drove aimlessly, eventually filling up my car and returning home late, surprised by how far I had driven. The house felt empty, like a mausoleum filled with memories of better times. I couldn't sleep, haunted by thoughts of what I had set in motion. Socrates once said that an unexamined life isn't worth living, but I avoided examining my own too deeply, especially now. It had gone too far to stop, and I worried it might unravel in court, potentially implicating me. I decided to get Layla out of town to minimize the risk. After a restless night, I called the kids, sensing Dean was already suspicious. I also reached out to Layla, who confirmed she'd leave for Chicago the next day, with $25,000 already in her account. George had arranged a job for her in property management. Later, Vicky called to tell me 3 of the women were suing Miller for damages, with papers being served Monday. We discussed how the situation had escalated, comparing it to the Harvey Weinstein case. That Saturday, I spent time with Dean and Katie, explaining that their mom and I were divorcing because of her affair with Miller. Katie cried, and Dean took it stoically. We spent the rest of the day at the driving range and had dinner together before heading home. On Sunday, I received calls from Jean's parents, asking if there was hope for reconciliation for the kids' sake, but I knew there wasn't. How can I reconcile with someone who's had an affair for years, especially with a man who's a predator? I told Jean's parents. They were shocked, unaware of the scandal in Illinois. I assured them the truth would come out in court and ended the call, hoping their image of Jean was shattered. Life moved slowly after that. Dean and Katie were back home, and my dad moved in to help. Business with George picked up, and we received glowing referrals. 2 weeks later, Vicky informed me that a 4th woman had joined the lawsuit against Miller, though, strangely, Layla hadn't. I had a meeting with Jean's lawyers to discuss the division of assets. I protected Dean and Katie's education funds and had already moved my final payouts offshore. Jean claimed we should have more cash, but I insisted it was lost in bad investments. When she called my bluff, I warned her that if she didn't accept the deal, I'd fight for the house and drain her financially. Jean alternated between anger, regret, and trying to blame me for her actions. At one point, she even suggested we try to work things out, but quickly shifted back to threatening to take me for everything. The battle dragged on for months, but I held most of the cards, fueled by righteous anger. At another meeting, when I refused to budge, Jean's lawyer threatened to get her back into the house immediately. I responded with a grin, warning Jean to tread carefully or I'd expose her complicity in a violent criminal gang. She turned pale, resembling someone in shock. "Try me," I said, "and see what happens next." As I left the office, I saw Evelyn in the foyer glaring at me. I smiled at her with the confidence of someone who had already won, and her smirk quickly faded. "You should have stayed out of it, Evelyn," I told her. "Now you'll face the consequences." 2 days later, I paid Layla another $5,000, and social media exploded with accusations that Evelyn had helped her father, Anthony Miller, recruit women for trafficking. The public outrage was swift, likening Evelyn to Ghislaine Maxwell. The DA's office faced backlash for not arresting either of them. Evelyn became a target, and the pressure mounted. Meanwhile, Miller was sued by the 4 women who had come forward. I began losing sleep, realizing that if this went to court, it could unravel everything and backfire on me. 6 weeks after my return from Singapore, I was working from home when the doorbell rang. It was Evelyn. She wanted to talk, but I wasn't in the mood to play nice. I refused at first, accusing her of trying to trap me into saying something she could use against me. She pleaded, and I eventually agreed, on the condition that she leave her phone and handbag in her car. After ensuring she wasn't recording anything, I let her in and made her sit across from me. Evelyn started by saying she thought I was a nice guy and begged me to stop what I had set in motion. She claimed the accusations against her father were lies and needed to be retracted, but I remained unmoved. I reminded her that it was now in the hands of the courts and mocked her for expecting help after her father had an affair with my wife. She was clearly defeated, tears streaming down her face as she asked when I would be satisfied. I made it clear there would be no peace until her family was completely destroyed. There was no stopping, no truce. The Millers would be utterly ruined, and that was the only outcome I sought. Evelyn realized the truth of my words but still tried one last time, offering herself to me as revenge, suggesting I make her my whore. I considered her, unmarried and recently single, fit and attractive, but instead of taking her up on the offer, I taunted her cruelly, asking if she wanted me to humiliate her in front of her father and Jean. She turned pale, called me a pig, and stormed out. I grabbed her arms, reminding her that I wasn't a predator like her father. Shaken, she fled to her car, driving off erratically. I felt both satisfaction at hurting her and disgust at my own brutality. The rest of the week was filled with meetings with lawyers and business deals. George and I were looking into promising companies on the Hong Kong and Johannesburg stock exchanges. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit against Miller gained momentum. The Millers, led by Evelyn, were trying to settle out of court while the DA hesitated to prosecute a dying man. A particularly damning revelation came from the accusers when one woman offered to describe Miller's genitals in detail, having been assaulted by him so often. This sealed the case. The Millers were financially ruined, their property sold, and the women received multi-million-dollar settlements. MRE was finished. I visited Miller in the hospital, determined to ensure he knew I was behind his downfall. I entered his room unnoticed and confronted him, telling him I had ruined his life and legacy for what he did with my wife. I asked if it was worth it, leaving him to die knowing he had lost everything. He passed away 2 days later, cremated in a small gathering attended by only 5 people, including Jean. Jean, devastated, confronted me, accusing me of ruining Miller's life. She admitted she loved him, claiming he gave her the attention she needed, unlike me, who always prioritized work and the kids. She said she had felt neglected, but I didn't let her dwell in her memories. Instead, I played a recording of my final conversation with Miller. He had confessed to using women for favors and admitted his guilt, revealing how my actions had unintentionally uncovered his predatory behavior. Miller boasted about taking Jean from me, but I reminded him it had cost him everything. Jean, overwhelmed by the truth, collapsed and went catatonic. I walked away, leaving her to deal with the consequences of her choices. She was no longer my concern. When MRE was offloading assets, I bought the house they intended for the New Horizons home at a great price. I announced through ads and radio that I would turn it into a women-run halfway house for abused women, naming it the Joy Carter Home after my mother. The home was placed in a trust, with my father, myself, and the 4 women who had sued Miller as trustees. They were eager to contribute both time and money to the project, earning praise from the media, though I kept a low profile. This move also worked in my favor during the divorce, helping me secure a deal where Jean got primary custody. I paid child support until the kids turned 18, and Jean stayed in the house while sharing the mortgage. There was no alimony. In one meeting, Jean accused me of hiding money, but I warned her off, and she backed down, clearly afraid of me. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. I bought a condo where Dean and Katie could stay on weekends since Jean worked a lot. I traveled frequently, especially to the Far East, but life wasn't too bad. Jean's relationship with Evelyn collapsed after I played the recording of Miller admitting his assaults, which I distributed widely. Evelyn disappeared after a few months, and I never heard from her again. I met Layla, whose real name was Leanne Roxton, in Chicago. She had cleaned up and was thriving at her job. When I asked her if she knew about the offense, she confirmed it was an open secret, though no one directly admitted it out of fear of being kicked out. She wasn't abused herself, but contacted others and offered them $5,000 to say they were. Rita French, one of them, ended up coming forward on her own, and from there, the Me Too movement took over. Layla reflected that she could have made more money, but by the time the lawsuit hit, she had already moved to Chicago and missed the chance. Despite this, she was grateful for the fresh start I'd given her. My revenge had unfolded better than I expected, and though I kept telling myself I wasn't a monster, I couldn't deny I had destroyed the Millers. Financially, I was doing well, and George even hinted at selling me his share of the business so he could retire. Dean and Katie had adjusted, focused on their own lives. 4 years after the divorce, Jean remarried. I remained single, struggling with trust. After some time, I began seeing a trauma counselor to heal, but I still had a long way to go.